Cool. Okay. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Ashley Duker, and alongside Giles Lindsay, my amazing partner in crime, we lead the Agility Leadership Network for Agilists and by Agilists. So it's great to see tonight so many new and familiar faces. And tonight we have Dave Snowden talking with us about an ecological approach to leadership in Agile. This is part of a mini-series that Nigel Thurlow kicked off at the end of last year, where he argued complexity that organizations face is human-led. So tonight, Dave will share with us 3 key areas for the future of agility and Agile, picking up on themes from his recent EU field guide to managing complexity and chaos. And Dave is the lead author of that. For those of you that don't know Dave, he's the creator of Cynefin Framework, the director of the Cynefin Centre. He originated the design of SenseMaker, which is an awesome distributed ethnography tool, and founder and chief scientific officer of Cognitive Edge. He's an author and professor at Universities of Pretoria and Stellenbosch, and visiting professor at the University of Hull, amongst numerous other titles that he holds. So after tonight, in a couple of weeks, we've got Simon Wardley building on this series of complexity. And this will culminate in March in a panel event that will bring it all together, which Dave will be back for, which is going to be awesome. So the questions you ask tonight will help us tailor what the panel will talk about in March. Mike Levings, huge shout out to you, because your question to Nigel at the end of last year is actually what kind of instigated and kicked this all off. So we're really looking forward to, thank you. We're really looking forward to a good Q&A session tonight. So please feel free to type your questions into the chat. Giles and I will field them during the course of Dave's talk. And then at the end, when we move into the QA portion, we'll ask you to use the raise hand functionality and then ask your questions at the end. If you're comfortable, come off mute and come onto the video and ask your questions straight to Dave. So without further ado, Dave, over to you.
Okay, so I've been promised there'll be lots of questions. So I plan to talk for about half an hour, 45 minutes, and then let it develop. So I really want to sort of hit a high level on this, and then I'll dive into more detail as people want it. Yeah. And I'm probably going to run through this in reverse order. I'm going to start about talking about this general ecological principle of landscape, and this links in with the paper that John Turner and myself and Nigel have just published. It got through peer review, which is actually taking constructor theory from quantum mechanics and applying it to human systems. It's not just quantum mechanics. It's some other stuff as well. Yeah. So I want to start with that because I think it makes a general point about the ecology of strategy. And that will lead me into some of the work we're doing on a multi-vendor approach in Agile. Yeah? There's a key principle of complex adaptive systems in that you scale complexity by decomposition and recombination, not by repetition. So one of the things we're now working on, which is going to be open source and we welcome participation in, is effectively something which decomposes Agile methods and frameworks to their lowest level of coherence and allows people to recombine them in context rather than adopt a single framework. Right? So that's a multi-method, multi-vendor type approach. So this will actually be the first time I've really talked about this. And by the way, it's not the same thing as Essence. We're working differently from that. It always comes up and people always say it, and no, it's not the same thing, Russ, right? And you know that because you've said that before, right? And then I want to also talk about the stuff, and this is linked in with work we're doing with Nigel as well, on what we're doing to actually create a Gemba Kaizen type approach into Agile team stand-ups, formation, and feedback mechanisms. So one of the things I got challenged on about a year or so ago is how do you measure the impact of Agile? And this is a method to do that. All right. So I'll sort of finish off on that. And then, as I say, I can dive deeper. So let me start off with the basic principle here. I first came across Constructor Theory at a wonderful festival. If you don't know it, it's called How the Light Gets In. It takes part in Hay on Wye every year. There's a big book festival at Hay. If you don't know it, Hay is just in Wales. It's called it's the town of books. Do not go there with a Kindle. Somebody will take it off and smash it, all right? This has got 5 specialist bookshops in, for example, detection theory. The whole place is just books. It's a wonderful place. And there's an annual book festival, which is a sort of huge event. And in parallel with that is a festival of philosophy and music, which I've been going to now ever since it started. And that certainly for journalists like me is a wonderful experience, because literally every day you go to 8 sessions. They're about 45 minutes each. Each one has got 3 philosophers or scientists or historians actively debating with each other. There's sort of detailed teaching sessions on things that you've never thought you would be interested in, but turn out to be so. So it's kind of like, it's a sort of festival for intellectual generalists, all right? And it does require Wellington boots because it has all those features of festivals, and there's some great music in the evening. So if you don't know about that, it is worth going to. Either way, one of the things I came across then was David Deutsch's work on constructor theory. And I thought at the time that I'm not sure, and my background is physics and philosophy, I'm not sure this is valid for physics, but I really think it's quite exciting for social systems. And we've been playing around with it for about 5 to 6 years. And then we got into constraint mapping, which is in the field guide, and then got into constructor theory. So I'll now explain that and explain what it isn't. If you look at the dominant approach to management, whether it's strategic or operational for the last 20 or 30 years, the approach has been to decide where you want to be and then try and close the gap. So the whole principle is, largely consultancy enabled, by the way. A team of consultants come in, they meet with senior executives, they spend a lot of time, rearranging platitudes on whiteboards, and they end up with a declaration of what sort of company they want to be in the future. And then they try and engineer the organization to achieve that goal. You can see the engineering background in this. Engineers want to be told what you want, then they'll go away and build it. And really, since the 80s, the engineering metaphor has dominated. Now, that's also produced the fad cycle, because one of the key things we know from complexity science is we don't have a linear relationship between cause and effect. And therefore, you can't actually predict the future. The key thing about complexity is you can't manage the future. And one of the lessons about complexity is it's more important to describe the present and identify pathways from the present which go in the right general direction, and then stay open on those pathways to novel discovery. One of the ways I've characterized this lately is to, sorry, just putting in the real festival name there to go with it. And one of the ways I characterize this lately is the Frozen 2 approach to strategy. This is an excuse for you now all to go and watch Frozen 2. You probably have to watch Frozen 1 to understand Frozen 2. Frozen 1 isn't that good. Frozen 2 is a brilliant complexity movie. And halfway through Frozen 2, the real heroine of the Frozen series, who is actually the younger sister without the magic, faced with a sort of almost impossible situation, sings this beautiful song. She says, all I can do is do the next right thing. Now that's a key complexity principle. If I want to get academic about it, it's what Stuart Kauffman called the adjacent possible. So faced with a complex situation, the key thing is to understand as much as possible about where you are and identify where it's practical to go next, and to make that move and then look again. So one of the things we say in complexity, and this is probably the most revolutionary statement you'll hear for some years, instead of planning where we want to be, we start from the present with a sense of direction. We don't have goals, we don't have aims. What's really important to is understand the present, identify which pathways are coherent and go generally in the right direction, and start down those pathways, often in parallel. This is the parallel safety experiment aspect of Cynefin. and then see what happens as we undertake that journey and be open to novel possibilities in terms of the direction. I'll make a general point here, and I'll go into this in detail if people want later. I think one of the things we were all trying to work on in object orientation in the 80s and 90s, and it's not the same thing as microservices, was effectively applications need to be architectures in which objects interact. So rather than designing an entire system, you design a scaffolding, an architecture, and you define people and software as objects to that architecture, and then you see how the thing evolves over time. And I'm going back to some of that work I did in the 80s at the moment, because we think that's actually highly relevant anyway. Now, if you're going to do this, you have to reduce uncertainty. And part of the problem with the current approach to strategy is it gives the appearance of getting rid of uncertainty. We've got clear goals, clear directions. Everybody needs to sort of, follow the banner. Sister Anna will follow the banner, to go back to the 50s and 60s, right? Now, the reality is that has consistently failed. And it's consistently failed because actually the future is always more uncertain than we realized. And goal achievement may blind us to opportunities anyway. And by the way, whenever people are working for extrinsic goals, it destroys intrinsic motivation. I mean, that's the raw science on it, which kind of like invalidates outcome-based targets anyway. So if we're going to take this approach, though, we've got to recognize that's where people are coming from. If we deal with the present, part of the present is people want goals and objectives. Now, that's where constructor theory comes in. And this comes from, as I say, from quantum mechanics, David Deutscher, and Carla's work. I would read Deutscher rather than Carla. She's gone down the populist route. And what it basically says is physics needs to stop trying to understand systems by finding the lowest individual part. I mean, I think, to be honest, when we got to quarks, it was going as far as made sense. I like quarks. They come in threes, right? But if you look at physics, it's historically been highly reductionist. Find smaller and smaller particles, validate the theory, and then build up from that. What constructor theory did is say, let's start with the whole system. And let's start off by defining a counterfactual. Right? So a counterfactual is define what isn't possible. Right? So the laws of gravity aren't going to change, is one example on that. Yeah. So basically, the first thing we do is to map in the space, not what is possible, but what isn't possible, because that bounds our universe. By the way, one of the ways we've been doing that for 30 years now in corporate mission statements and strategy is to agree narratives of what we don't want to be. It's actually quite easy to get consensus on what we don't want to be. It's almost impossible to get consensus on what we do want to be. So actually, alignment is easier around a negative than it is a positive. And I'll make the general point there is all the fairy stories we read to our children at night are stories of failure, not success, because they're ways of passing on the wisdom of what doesn't work to the next generation, but leave open to them the direction of their travel. So I'm not talking about something which we don't already understand, but that's there. So counterfactuals are important, and this is me now starting to add to counterfactual theory, because physicists see counterfactuals as absolute. In social systems, they're not. So you've got to ask of any counterfactual, can we change it? And if so, at what energy cost over what time? No? Because if the energy cost is too high and the time is too long, then it's a true counterfactual. It ain't going to change. If we could change it within a time horizon, we look at the energy cost of doing that and we can make decisions and decide what we do as a result. So we start by, there's a stage before that which I'll come on to, but we basically start with what are the things which are not possible, and of those things which are not possible, can they ever become possible, and if so, over what time, at what energy cost? Energy is going to be a key word throughout this. Right? Evolution tends to minimize energy consumption. All right, and human systems are the same, right? So this is all about energy gradient. If the energy gradient of sin is lower than the energy gradient of virtue, people will always sin. So if you want to achieve behavioral change, you have to change you don't actually preach the virtues you want. You have to change the energy gradient or the processes so the things you want have a lower energy gradient than the things that you don't want. And again, that's one of these really radical changes in organizational theory, which we're working on. Then the second thing you do is look for what are called constructors. Constructors are things which produce replicable outcomes. Right? One of the reasons people in quantum mechanics, by the way, are getting very excited about constructor theory is it removes quantum uncertainty. It resolves that problem. So a constructor is, let me give you two extreme examples. A machine is a constructor, almost literally. You put the right raw materials in, the same thing constantly comes out. At the softer end of that, in human beings, ritual acts as a constructor. Also habit. I'm writing a whole blog series on at this moment. This is kind of like the level beyond practice theory. Yeah. It's Bourdieu's concept of habitat, if you want to get into philosophy of it. Basically, what ritual and habit do is they basically embody practice so we don't have to think about it. And if we had to think about everything we did, we actually would never do anything. Right? This is also called autonomic processing, if you want to look into cognitive theory. So a constructor is something which produces a replicable outcome. So the next thing we want to do is to basically say, well, what are the constructors currently in play? One of the things I'll have written up within the next 2 or 3 days is how do you map rituals and habits? I'm actually creating a typology of those at the moment because they're some of the most significant, but it's also things like processes. Yeah, and it's quality control mechanisms. There's all sorts of things which human beings have devised which produce replicable outcome because we don't want all the time to be sort of thinking anew and designing anew. We want to fall into habituated patterns. So we need to map the constructors and we need to identify, again, getting into this mapping question, what are they? Can they be changed? What's the energy cost of change? What's the temporality of that change? And is change desirable? Yeah. Now, all I've done so far is map where I am. We then start to create hypotheses about what might be a useful direction of travel. And that's where we use safe to fail experiments effectively to stimulate the formation of constructors. So you run multiple parallel safe to fail experiments, and we these days we call them probes, not experiments, because they're not experiments that succeed or fail. They're parallel probes, which changes the landscape so you can see new possibilities. Yeah? And the minute you get a constructor, you identify it. So what we're doing is creating that map of what's certain and what isn't. If you want a metaphor for this, and the name of this framework, by the way, is going to be another Welsh word, all right? In Wales, we have 15 different words for an estuary. Yeah, and I've got a session I'm going to set up with first language Welsh speakers because I daren't do this without consultation first, all right? And pick one of those. At least 5 of them are pronounceable by the English without too much difficulty, right? But the estuary is a really powerful metaphor here. And constructor theory is not the same thing as constructional law, which actually I don't like very much. Although it's interesting, a lot of people at the sort of systems dynamic end of complexity theory like constructional law because it implies this sort of linear flow. One of the things about human systems, to my mind, is they're non-linear. And if you want, later on, I'll go into the stuff we're doing on peace and reconciliation, which says the way you break habits is by entanglement around points of empathy, not around preaching. And that's a really interesting area of work at the moment, but I'll go into that if people want later. Yeah. So what I'm trying to do is to create this basic sort of where are we, what are we doing, probing, seeing what works. If it works, start to stabilize it, start to form it type approach. Yeah. And in order to do that, we kind of like have a general sense of direction, but we don't have specific goals and objects. This also links in with a key theory of change, which is called a vector theory of change. Right, so vectors measure direction and speed of travel for intensity of effort. And I can target people on a vector as an alternative to an outcome. So in an ordered system, I can have outcome-based targets. In a complex system, I need vector-based targets. Yeah? And that then starts to create this very different dynamic in terms of the way we work. Now, what we've also done this is map this back into the European Field Guide, which Alessandro, I think, is on the call, yeah, and I wrote, yeah. And one of the big things in that is constraint mapping. So we created a typology of constraints. And a key distinction in constraints, and this goes back to Alicia Gerraro, is the difference between governing constraints and enabling constraints. Yeah, so I've often said, if you want a metaphor for that, it's like the difference between an external and an internal skeleton, an exto and an endoskeleton. So an enabling constraint is a type of structured connectivity which allows some things to grow and develop. Again, to quote Alicia, and sorry for the academic language here, if you have a system in which everything is equiprobable, nothing changes. When you introduce constraints, things can change. So without constraints, there isn't any evolution anyway. Yeah, it is just random. So enabling constraints effectively allow the system to structure and evolve, and governing constraints act more like containers in that sense. Now, the trouble is, whenever we talk about constraints, people start to think about Goldratt and theory of constraints. And of course, with Goldratt, all constraints are negative and they're there to be refused. And I'm getting to the point where I don't think we'll change people on that. So one of the things we now start to look at is we can do the constraint mapping, which is in the EU Field Guide, and I'll share in a minute in the chat some pictures of the sort of stuff we're doing on that in terms of facilitation kits. And then after we've done the constraint mapping, which is an established method, we can identify which constraints are counterfactuals and which constraints are constructors. So instead of talking about enabling and governing constraints, we can effectively move into counterfactuals and constructors, and that makes that easier for people to understand. Now, one of the reasons we do constraint mapping is to avoid a classic problem in that no human being can ever evaluate a system objectively. Doesn't matter how well you're trained. Yeah. What everybody is doing if they get into evaluation is they've already decided what they should do, and the evaluation is being biased to support that action. I mean, this links in with inattentional bias and everything else. So rather than try and stop people doing that, because we can't except by making them subhuman, what we actually do instead is we need to create a method for situational assessment, which is not in any way linked to an action. And that's what constraint mapping does. Yeah, by mapping the constraints, and then you can have conversations about changing the constraints, you avoid that bias within the system. And that leaves open more possibilities. And critically, radically reduces the energy cost of strategy, because it reduces the danger of failure really significant. So this is a risk reduction method. Yeah. I'm hoping you're seeing how this goes across into software development, because there are obvious feeds across into what we're now talking about as a complexity-based approach to software architecture, yeah, which is about doing things like counterfactuals and constructions and scaffolding, yeah, and then allowing things to emerge and reinforce. Yeah, and again, that's what OO was meant to be about if you go back to the Corba stuff in the 80s. And just as a sideline on that, I and others in Corba in the 1980s were arguing that people were objects too. Yeah, it wasn't just software, that we needed to think about people and groups of people as objects, which were polymorphic, which had inheritance, which had input-output. And if we started to architect in that way, we could get rid of this sort of artificial separation between technology and people, and we could create something far more coevolutionary in terms of the way things worked. So that's a high-level view on constructor theory. it links in with also this stuff we're starting to do on method. Now, this is something I originally developed when I was in IBM, and we've just brought it back into play. What we wanted to avoid was people, in effect, trying to adopt a single framework or a single approach. This was a major problem in IBM, and it still is a problem in most organizations. The attractions of things like SAFe and Scrum is that they give you an entire structure and then you sort of follow that structure. Now, the approach we did, and there was a lot of science which went into that, not just from me, but from other people. I've just put up 3 pictures into the chat, which you're welcome to have a look at, right? Is we started to look at using hexagon-based cards. Now, the reason you use hexagons is people combine them in novel combinations. They have a very low tessellation factor. Yeah. And if you give people hexagons to brainstorm on, they tend to form honeycomb type patterns rather than put things into boxes. It's why I've never liked cards, because cards are rectangles. Yeah. So what we've done here is effectively to create, for every method or tool or principle, is a single hexagon. Yeah. And I've, you can see the picture here. These are the ones which link to the methods in the EU field guide. And we've been negotiating now with several people. Comic Agile have agreed to be part of this, along with a lot of other people, effectively to create a open source Agile set of hexagons. Yeah? The way we're doing by this way as the Cynefin company, by the way, is the core framework is not branded Cognitive Edge deliberately. It's an open source branding. And the standards for the hexagons have been released into open source, so anybody can produce their own and they'll work with other people. That's going on at the moment. Yeah. So our methods will have our branding on them, but the general pack will be non-cognitive edge branding. That's kind of like a service type stuff.
Dave, I think you're looking at the 3 diagrams.
I put some pictures in the chat. You should be able to see them. I can see them.
You sent them to me, David. I'm very privileged.
I'll repost them. Oh, sorry, Russ.
I'll repost them
because you sent me a message. If you could do me a favor and share them with everybody.
I'll repost them, yeah.
That would be useful.
Thank you. Right? Sorry for interrupting.
Okay, so you'll see, I mean, this has been about 9 months of work in design and everything else as we've gone through. So for example, if I take Scrum as a method, what this allows me to do is to peel out Sprint, because Sprint is one of the lowest levels of coherence, and replace Sprint with a 3-month time box. Okay? So what it allows is this sort of mix and match of things to actually go together. And we're not just doing it for Agile, we're doing it for organizational development and strategy. And all of those kits can start to come together. Yeah? So this is, as I say, being launched. And the intention is that the Agile one will be a collaborative development. We've got a lot of the XP people really interested. We're talking with other people, and that will be put out fairly shortly. This is, if I'm honest, designed as an alternative to SAFe. There's probably about 4 or 5 original methods in SAFe. The rest is borrowed and stolen from multiple other people. So the basic principle here is, well, why don't you just go back to the originals and put them together in different combinations? You don't have to have a single framework to do that. It allows you to construct. And what it is, if you think about it, is each of the methods is actually a constructor. We know a method produces a consistent output. So I can put them together in different combinations and manage that sort of emergent flow. Yeah. Now, that's kind of like there now. We're looking for 5. We've got the first pack we've produced is an assessment against the field guide. So what did we do during COVID? And we're looking to work with 5 companies or consultants with companies to actually complete the prototyping of that. Yeah. Now, in parallel with that, the other thing we've been doing, and this was Nigel's original idea, and he'll never forgive me if I don't attribute him to the idea, right? Doesn't have many ideas, so you have to actually give him credit when he does. Sorry, I've got to do the negative with the positive, all right? And he's completely wrong on human-initiated complex systems, but never mind, we'll leave that for the panel session, right? The concept of a Gemba system or a Kaizen system is that what you want is continuous real-time observation in the field rather than structured intervention surveys or periodic assessments. First time I ever did this was with the US Army in Afghanistan, when we said to company commanders, if you keep field records up to date in the Gemba system, you don't have to write a patrol report, which meant we got 100% compliance because we made their lives easier. Remember that thing about energy gradient? It's easier to do stuff continuously than do it at the end of a patrol, yeah? And it gave us much better data in real time because we could now look at human metadata across multiple company commanders. We could combine that with machine data, traditional scanning data, and that actually gave us a considerable improvement on what, sorry, this is black humor, is called the three-legged goat problem. If you don't get that one, if you see a goat with 3 legs, it's probably a weak signal of a bomb factory because somebody's blown the leg off one of their goats. Yeah, so it's black humor when you work with military people. Yeah? So what we've, again, and we got 5 slots for this, is the Gemba system is now designed for people in an Agile team to keep continuous notes and observations, including recording interviews with every user they interact with. Right? This is also linked with unarticulated needs. And the stuff we did with Boeing originally, which is, you know, micro anomalies. We actually have a setting on this by which you can say this is a micro anomaly, at which point it automatically gets anonymized. Because when micro anomalies cluster, you get early indication of major failure. You can see how this starts to work in project management, is if you empower teams to capture micro anomalies or micro concerns, then as those concerns start to build into patterns, you'll get early detection of project deviance before it gets reported by a project manager. It also links in with work we've already done with Walters in Romania to automate the stand-up. So the stand-up material effectively comes from the multiple real-time observations rather than from an artificial event and can move into continuous. And we're moving that effectively into continuous flow. Yeah. So I said I'd talk for about 40 minutes. I'm coming up to that now, right? Let me kind of like summarize this. And I'm too excited by all of this, so I may have used bad language and not explained things enough, and feel free to dive me deeper. If you're going to take an ecological approach to stuff, not an engineering approach, then you have to deal with things as a complex ecology in which everything is uncertain. So let me come back to the estuary. In an estuary, the water flows both ways. Yeah, which direction the tide is highly significant. Yeah. If you've got a granite cliff, you only have to map that every 10 years. If you've got sandbanks, you have to map them every hour. Yeah. If you get effectively salt marshes, yeah, salt marshes can absorb a lot of liquid without catastrophic release, whereas dams involve catastrophic release. Yeah, in many cases, you need a local pilot to navigate because there's no way anybody who hasn't grown up in the area can understand the channels. And you have to read signals from weak patterns on the water, which take time to acquire. So the estuarine metaphor is that's why that's the sort of name we're going to use for this, is treating the organization effectively as an estuarine system. It has stable and unstable bits. Sometimes it goes forwards, sometimes it goes backwards. It's much easier to go out on an ebb tide. Yeah, you can see how the metaphors come here. And I've got 3 books on nautical charts on the floor of the study here, because I'm going to shamelessly steal from nautical mapping in terms of symbols and everything else, in terms of the way we do that, because we're trying to get to this point where you have a single representation of the status of the company in its direction. Yeah. And I mean that quite seriously. You actually, it's like if you're navigating in a mountain, you need a single map, you need a single sense of direction. You've got to be able to represent the complexity of an organization's present and future potential within a single map. And that links in with the stuff we've done on Fletcher's curves and various other work on that. So complex systems decompose and then recombine. You decompose to the lowest level of coherent granularity, right? So as I say, you can't really take a sprint down much more than a sprint. Yeah. Time boxes, you can actually create different categories of time boxes and so on. If you look at any agile method or any agile tool, it will break into separate things which are coherent of themselves and then can be combined and recombined with other things. And we also want to make sure that the same tools and kit which are used for agile are used for organizational change methods. Yeah? And as you can see on the hexagons, they've all got QR codes. The QR codes feed into the open source wiki if there are methods, or into the Scrum site if it's Scrum or whatever. So again, and we want to do this collaboratively. So a final lesson on this, yeah. For those of you who remember the Agile Manifesto, there were 3 groups that came together to form it. One was XP, the other was Scrum, and the third was DSDM. Right? The one that everybody forgets. And I've been saying for years that actually XP is at the heart of Agile, but I have to be careful there because Alistair now thinks he owns the concept. Yeah. And I said this at a big conference, you know, I said this at a conference in Lean Agile Scotland, and all the XP people cheered me. And they didn't realize what I was going to say next. And I said, the trouble is that nobody who's an ordinary citizen can understand anybody who's an XP expert in the first place. So it was never going to scale. The point is to go back to Max Boisseau, and if you haven't read Boisseau's Knowledge Assets, you should. Scrum was at exactly the right level of codification and abstraction that it could diffuse very quickly. Yeah? Whereas XP required far more expertise and time and apprentice models, so it couldn't codify fast, so it couldn't diffuse fast. The SDM actually could have done more, but it only had one representative, and that was the last minute. If you don't know it, DSDM was formed by me when I was strategy director of data sciences, along with my equivalent in Logica and Ed Holt, yeah, from Cambridge. And we met in a pub in Cheltenham over dinner and sorted out the DSDM consortium. We're British, so we do dinner in a pub. We don't need a week in a ski resort to do this sort of stuff, right? Now, the key thing I want to make a point about this is DSDM was a collaboration between competitors, not a single proprietary approach. And I think one of the ways that Agile has got really badly wrong is everybody is trying to create a proprietary approach. Yeah, and you can see it now with, you know, nonsense like Agile 2, yeah. And I see Jürgen Apollo has decided to draw pretty pictures around the Spotify model and has forgotten that Spotify don't think they've got a model in the first place. So everybody is trying this. I've got the method, here it is, here's the framework, adopt it, do my certificates, do my training. We think it's time for a radical reset, and you should certify and train people in methods and tools, but not in frameworks. Right? And then you combine and recombine methods and tools uniquely in context. And to me, that is a complex adaptive system approach to scale. We combine it with counterfactuals and constructors, and we've got something which is a very low energy cost to achieving sustainable and contextual change. And with that point, I'll finish. Sorry, I threw a lot at you guys there.
Dave, look, firstly, thank you very much indeed. The amount of conversation in the chat, if you haven't seen it, as we've been chatting away, has been phenomenal. Lots of questions, lots of people trying to answer. So firstly, thank you very much, Dave. If anyone would like to ask Dave a question, can we use the raise hand feature if you've got it, or let us know in the chat? The raise hand feature should be a major part of Zoom. And we have about 40 minutes or so for Q&A for Dave, for those that would like to ask him a question. So who would like to ask Dave the first question of the evening?
Or disagree with him, that's fine.
Or disagree with him. Holger is in first off. Holger, good to see you, man.
Well, as usual,
you're one of the early ones in. So Holger, over to you.
I pick up this message which you said with a start from present and then walk in the approximate correct direction. How do we do this in the usual setup in corporations, where senior management has a strategy or vision and sets definite goals and so on, and we at the front have to work with it? How do you suggest we convince them for a better way?
First of all, you don't. You just look at whatever they've produced, which will be a set of platitudes, and you reinterpret what you're going to do in that language. It's what everybody does anyway, right? So, you know, if you look at the sort of, you know, we will be X, Y, Z, or we will have a trusted environment, or all of those statements, just accept that that's part of the landscape. Now, remember I talked about counterfactual mapping? Those are counterfactuals. All right, so what's the corporate strategy? What are the corporate people telling us to do? That's a counterfactual. Can I change it? What's energy cost over what time? Yeah, and then you design within that. I mean, I say the good news is that I've been through so many bloody change initiatives in my life, and I'll tell you a story on this. All right, so IBM rebranded while I was there. Some of you heard this before. It went from being e-this to on-demand, if anybody remembers that period. Yeah, and it was nothing to do with any market need. We just had a new chief executive officer, and chief executive officers like rebranding exercises. It's kind of like the male pissing on the trees to establish territory. Is most rebranding, right? And I was at a board meeting because at that time they were saying what I was doing was Linux for consultancy, and they owned Linus. So I had a lot of access before it all went wrong with Ginny Rometty, right? Which is a story in its own right. And somebody said to me, what do you think about the branding change? And I got really irritated because I just spent 18 months of my life working on it. If you've had to spend hours of your day with Ogilvy and Mather in New York with them hiding the creatives and trying to manage corporate politics in IBM at the same time, that's a penance, which I think is only at least 500 years off some circle of purgatory at some stage, right? So either way, I got irritated, and you should never irritate the Welsh, all right, or the Irish for that matter. We have this suicidal tendency of irritated, to hell with it. And I said, it's a wonderful way of deciding who to fire in your first 6 months of office. And there was total silence around the board table. And Sam basically turned to me and said, what did you mean by that, buddy? Just to warn you, when an American puts buddy at the end of a sentence, it's like a rattlesnake shaking its tail. It's kind of like a warning sign. And I said, well, anybody who's changed their business strategy from E to on demand in less than 6 months is obviously a sycophant using find and replace functions in word processing. So I assume you're going to fire them. At which point there was a roar of laughter around the table because everybody had done that. Half of them knew they were doing it and took me out for dinner afterwards so we could have a chat about it, right? And I'm being slightly cynical here, but the cynics are the ones who care. Most of the constraints provided by corporate strategy and directions are just groups of language which you can adopt for camouflage purposes, but it is a counterfactual. Sorry, I'll try and be fast on the next answer.
No,
thank you,
Dave. Thanks very much indeed. Julia, you're up next.
And you're muted.
Yeah. No, still can't hear you.
You got the right mic, Julia.
Type very fast.
Should we go to Christina and give
yeah,
Julia
let's do that. That's a great show.
We'll circle back.
We'll come back to you, Julia.
Okay.
Christina, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Dave. Very interesting talk. I just had a quick question. So in talking about the fact that, low energy costs, that, people tend to go ahead with change where the low energy is much, it's easier. I'm wondering in terms of, for me, everything that you're saying about having just focusing on method and tools and not necessarily a strict framework is awesome. But I'm wondering how Agile has helped itself so far because of the high energy cost for people to kind of get into the Agile community. And I say this because I love the Agile community, but at the same time, I'm very much aware of when you enter, there is you have to change your mindset. You have to do this because everything that you're doing is absolutely wrong and has been wrong for so far.
Yeah.
And it does kind of make people who start in the community go, this is too high energy. And I'm not really sure how, where my...
When I sort of love the Agile community as well, but I love them in the way that I loved my daughter when she hit puberty. It's kind of like, when is this going to be over, right?
Yeah.
And I think if you look at Agile at the moment, the trouble is we went from what was actually quite an interesting side. I mean, I was writing code back in the 80s and 90s, decision support systems for people like Guinness. And it was fairly fluid and fairly flexible. You know, and XP was coming along and we were playing with early days AI, and it was quite that. And then the framework started to hit. Yeah. And I think the problem with the frameworks is the Scrum model, which, and by the way, I just want it's very clear, I've been defending Scrum against people like the Shalloway and others, because Scrum is one of the best methods I've seen in software development in my life. It's brilliant at making complex things complicated. Yeah, but it's not a complex technique. It's a contextual method of high utility. Yeah, and it's not a framework, actually. It's a collection of methods. Yeah? So the trouble is that Ken went down the certification route. And this is apex predator theory. Yeah, what happened is then after that, everybody else went into certificates. And then Dean came along, and Dean's approach to developing frameworks is anything anybody wants to buy, he will produce a safe version of it and sell you a certificate in it. I mean, that's the basic structure of safe. And I think that's where it's got perverted. So the energy cost of Agile adoption favors certificate gatherers rather than good coders. And the business model of Agile rewards people who do training and certification, not people who write code. So one of the things we're trying to do is to break that down a bit, right? And yeah, I can criticize Dean for exploiting the market. I can criticize Oxfam people for exploiting young people in Africa, all right? Dean knew exactly what he was doing and it was wrong, right? And yeah, I will continue to say that, right? Yeah, we need to break the certification. The way we're looking at this, and we're going to create a structure for this within the hexagons, is you can certify people in a method, but not in a framework. So a method could, for example, be, well, you can just use it. It doesn't need training. Some need training, some need experience. Yeah. So I think the granularity is wrong. And you can see what I'm doing now. Certification is part of the counterfactual universe. So we change what we certify so that we can get things going in the right direction. Yeah. So I think that's where Agile's got to go. It's got to move away from these huge things. Yeah. In that sense. And then I think you can get less religious about it. Yeah. I mean, the Scrum Kanban wars, I've never understood the Scrum Kanban war. I mean, I go back to Tolkien, you know, doubtless, you know, the famous elf put down, you know, doubtless to sheep, other sheep appear different or to shepherds, but we have made no study of them, right? Which is one of the great put downs in literature. So I think there's a lot to work around on that. But again, you've got to be careful on this because complexity says start from where things are, not from where you would like them to be. Yeah, and you can see me doing that, yeah, in the way this works.
Fantastic. Dave, thanks. Christina, hopefully that answers your question. Julia, are you back with us? Is your mic now working?
I very much hope so.
Yes.
Awesome.
All right, over to you.
So thinking about the opposite direction from what we were talking about a moment ago around interpreting strategy statements set by sort of corporate directory types, are there any good examples of organizations articulating strategy in a non-deterministic way that we might learn from?
Yeah, if you go back and look at some of Taylor's case studies. And I'll make a general point here. Agile people demonize Taylor. And they're actually demonizing Taylor. They're demonizing systems dynamics. Yeah, all the things they're talking about are things that came in with business process re-engineering and learning organization. Yeah. Everybody forgets Taylor was actually trying to build a more humane workplace. I mean, okay, we now look at production lines and say it's dehumanizing. Well, God, you should have seen what he was replacing. That was even worse, yeah? And I mean, I had the privilege of teaching with Drucker on 3 or 4 executive seminars. And one of the things we both agreed is that scientific management and complexity theory have a hell of a lot in common. And they both contradict systems dynamics and generally systems theory, actually, because I would include cybernetics in that, yeah? Because both of them respect human judgment. All right? And what we've seen for the last 30 years is an attempt to remove human judgment. And part of the sin of technology is technology has gone along with this. And I mean, I'm jumping around a bit, but I remember I was sitting with John Poindexter, who, for various reasons, I didn't know who he was when I first met him. And by the time I decided I liked him, it was too late to realize I wasn't meant to like Reagan's NSA, all right? And we were at the conference down in Langley, and somebody said, what do you think about AI? And this is in the context of counterterrorism. And both of us said, we weren't sure who was being asked the question, and both of us answered it simultaneously. Nobody's thinking about the training data sets. Everybody's thinking about the algorithms. Now, if you look at the Scholastic's Parrots paper from the Google people, they're now waking up to that. Yeah, the algorithms are easy. It's the bloody training data sets that matter. And that's where you need human judgment, right? I wrote a paper for ITEL which said no software engineer should be allowed out without a training in ethics and some test of their attitude to ambiguous ethical positions because of what they're actually doing, right? So, you know, I've rambled around a bit on the question, but I think all of those are really important for the direction of travel we need to take.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Julia. Awesome question. Thank you. Dean, good to see you, man. Over to you.
Thank you, Charles. Dave, as you may know, objectives and key results are very much in vogue at the moment. They definitely seem to be the flavour of the month. I was just wondering, with respect to what you shared this evening, using OKRs for strategy deployment, so you might have a vision, multi-year objectives, and they get decomposed down to quarterly outcomes. If they're used to enable transparency and alignment, and they're changed incrementally every quarter, do you think that could be in alignment to what you're suggesting this evening?
No, I think they're wrong a priori.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They only work for an ordered system. Right, so just reducing the cycle time can mitigate the damage, but yeah, they're still taking a reductionist approach, and they're assuming you can define outcome. A vector is actually much more effective. So, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say OKRs are wrong, but I would say OKRs which are outcome based are wrong. We need OKRs which are vector based. And that's one of the things we're doing with the Gemba systems by creating this mass micro narrative capture into quantitative frameworks. We can, for example, produce fitness landscapes which represent culture. So we can show what the culture currently looks like and what the evolutionary possibilities are for it. And we can achieve change within that. This is part of vector theory of change. I mean, let me illustrate it because it will make the point, all right? So one of the things we've been doing is working with Gaping Void, if you know Gaping Void. But we could do this with comic Agile as well. So you present a series of cartoons, and this is using Semioptics. It's abstraction, allows human beings to say things they couldn't otherwise say. There's the whole science behind this. So you present a series of cartoons, and you choose the cartoon which represents the organization you're in. and you tell a story about why you chose it, and then you interpret that. We have signifiers based on cultural anthropology, yeah, which has a reasonable base to it. And then we draw a fitness landscape, and this is where we're going down the estuary model, but at the moment it looks like a contour map, in which if you have contours close together, you have a very strong culture. If the contours are far apart, the culture is weaker and it's easier to change. And you've got overlaps and outliers. And the way you look at that, this is the more like this, feel like that. You look at the culture map and you say, well, I don't like it being there. I'd like it to be over here. So you find a cluster of narratives, which is in the place you want. You say, what can I do tomorrow to create more stories like those and fewer stories like these? Right? Now that actually can be measured, and that's a type of OKR. That's a vector measure. Yeah, did I actually get more stories like these and fewer stories like that? It's the same, and this is the stuff we're doing on 360, which we're now applied to Thames. Emily's done a 360 survey in their lives. Yeah, it was one of the many things which got me into trouble with IBM HR. I had a running war with IBM HR. One of the things was actually, well, the famous one was when I proved that astrology was more accurate than Myers-Briggs in predicting senior team performance. They never quite forgave me for that one, right? Don't understand irony in research. But then I actually created a database where you could nominate yourself to be set, and using dating agency software, so that you could find the third quartile responder, and the algorithms would tell you how to respond to gain the 360 feedback system. So we had a lot of that, and then for some reason HR objected to that, right? So the way 360 works is you know, people who work for you say what they think about you as a leader, which I don't think is ethical. I really don't, right? And it's evaluative and it's stressful and it's once a year and you don't know why. So we take a different approach. Every time people who work for you interact with you, they describe the interaction into the Gemba system. Yeah, take a picture, voice, text, whatever. Then they interpret the experience onto all positive signifiers. So for example, we use a triangle which says in this observation, the manager's behavior was analytical, altruistic, assertive. All three of which are valid behaviors. It's always positive. And then the manager looks at the pattern and sees they're all analytical, assertive, and they got very few altruistic. So they can say, what can I do tomorrow to create more stories like these and fewer stories like those? Now that we're bringing across onto team feedback now. Okay, so what you've got is a continuous feedback loop with micro interventions. But coming back to your question, Dean, those are all measurable. It's got to be quant. It can't be qual. Yeah, and the work I've done over the last years is to make culture change a quant technique, not a qual technique, because quant can't be gamed. Yeah. And then I can fit it into an OKR type structure.
Understood. Thank you.
And by the way, anything which is a fashion has generally arisen because something has just failed, and that's going to fail in its own turn. Yeah, I'm being very cynical now, but that's the way these things work.
All right, brilliant, Dave. Thanks, Dean. Thanks very much for the question. Cheers, man. Philippe, over to you, please.
Hi, Dave. Quick question, and for everybody's benefit and mine, could you clarify the distinction you make between constructors and scaffold?
Okay. So some of this stuff we're still playing around with. Yeah. I actually think, I mean, the answer, Philippe, is I'm still working on that. Yeah. So we're thinking about redescribing constraints as scaffolding. Right. So rather than talk about constraints, we talk about scaffolding. Scaffolding can be internal, external. So to give something on the metaphor here, there's for example, there's something new come out to the States at the moment, which I'm personally excited about, which is effectively a type of electromagnetic structure which gets taped onto your knees, which creates a structure in which cartilage can regrow under the kneecaps. Now, this is actually really exciting in terms of, you know, certainly for those of us who spend a lot of time with physio tape before we go walking and use walking sticks, all right, even though we're climbing. So that's a type of scaffolding. There's a microcardial lace, which goes onto somebody's heart, sinks into the heart, and these microelectrical filaments to actually restore the heart. So those are all types of scaffolding, right? So my feeling at the moment, and so we're still developing the theory, the paper is the first one out, is that scaffolding can be a counterfactual or it can be a constructor. Yeah. But my gut feel says scaffolding is probably a third component. Yeah. It's kind of like the architecture of the system in which counterfactuals and constructors exist. And I think that's probably where it will end up. Yeah. But yeah,
could you have scaffolds being an ensemble of constructors as well?
Yeah, and I mean,
any relationships or
I actually wrote about this on the blog a few days ago. I actually bought a book in MIT Press years ago, which is it was an impulse buy. It's like a $70 book, which is now out of print. But it's developing scaffoldings in evolution, culture, and cognition. So it's part of theoretical biology. And it's actually quite exciting. If you check the blog over the recent few weeks, you'll see me starting to pull some stuff out of that. And one of the things it basically points out is the way in which symbols and rituals in human beings create scaffolding around which cognition can evolve. Yeah? As I say, my gut feel is that cognition, scaffolding is a third component with counterfactuals and with constructors in the mapping.
Thank you.
Thanks, Philippe. Alkesh, good to see you, man. Over to you.
Hi, thank you, Dave, for an interesting talk. And I love common sense stuff, as the guys will tell you here, and a lot of what you said does kind of make sense. My question is, when you've got an ordered structure like some of our major organizations that are trying to transform from old ways of working to an agile way of working at scale, they're looking at a world in which they can only understand things like OKRs and that kind of stuff. Where does all this fit in? Because if I was to go to one of them and say, no, forget what the vision is, you just want to concentrate on where you are now and we'll experiment our way into finding the right route, I'd get laughed out. I think I appreciate what you're saying. It makes a lot of sense. And then the adaptive point of view, etc., and understanding what they've got in the first place is critical. But we're faced with transformations where people don't think that way. So what's your advice on how do we get them from A to B?
First of all, I mean, just to expand on something I said earlier, that's a counterfactual. Okay. Right, that's part of your map. So if they've got, and then you look at how can I change this at low energy cost? So for example, when we've been working with the NHS, and this is now, it's taken me a year or so, we say basically, look, you can have outcome-based targets. You know, the research basically says, and I can send you the link on this, whenever people are working for explicit goals, it destroys intrinsic motivation. Okay? So question number one, the executive, do you need intrinsic motivation in this job? Right? If you do, we can't have an explicit goal, we've got to have a vector goal. Yeah? So you do a both and approach, not an either or. Yeah. And you do it by questions so that people answer the questions. And a large, we call this disintermediation. A large part of the way, for example, we use SenseMaker, and just done a big project with the EU on this, where we've been using artists to interpret narrative on what are called meaning walls. So basically, you find some stories, you're interested in the stories, you interpret them, then you see how other people have interpreted them, and you're asked why. Yeah? And then an artist interprets them. So we've done a lot of work, for example, by defining stories from an organization, and then showing this is how management see those stories, this is how workers see these stories, what do you think it means? Okay? And so I think that the way you change decision making, Agile people get senior executives wrong. I've been a C-level executive most of my life, all right? You hardly ever get to make a decision, right? You're constantly being presented with 5 or 6 people who've researched something forever, all of them got a good idea. You've got 10 minutes to make a decision. and you've got 5,000 people to keep happy, all right? And therefore, you've got to make that pathway easy. I mean, the minute somebody says we didn't have leadership backing and that's why we failed, well, actually, you failed. Yeah, leadership backing isn't a cause of your failure; it's a symptom of your failure because you made it too difficult. Yeah, and the confusion of symptoms with causes is almost like an epidemic in systems thinking, because it constantly looks at symptoms and interprets them as causes. Stop grinning like Alessandra, you know what I mean.
Thank you.
But look, I can't overemphasize this. You map counterfactuals includes what your executives are prepared to do. Yeah, this is a very pragmatic approach, which always starts, if you're an agent for change and you want to do something, the minute, I mean, the one thing we advise companies on is if you want to change the culture, do not announce a cultural change program because you doom it to fail. Because people have heard so many previous such announcements, they just go into gaming mode. Yeah, and agile transformation is in the same process. The transformation word should probably be banned. Yeah,
Agree.
Thanks, Alkesh. Thanks, Dave. We've got about 12, 13 minutes left. So, Baz, over to you.
Right, thank you. Would you advise what you said, the decompose, recombine approach if it comes to teams or departments or groups of humans? When you say large teams or siloed departments, things like that, would decompose, recombine? If that's a valid approach, do you have some suggestions?
Yeah, and I think one of the methods, we developed 2 methods which you can look at, and I must make sure I don't just send this to Russ, all right, because he's still set up there. We developed a method called the triopticon. This is Colin Page's visualization of it in the open source wiki, so the credit. That's the way you bring 3 different knowledge bases together, or 3 different groups who have different opinions. So it's a highly structured dance. It's a conflict resolution tool and a transdisciplinary integration tool. Yeah. So you could, for example, use it between IT users and management, would be a way in which it uses at an early stage of the cycle. And I say it's a structured approach, yeah, into the way it works. We also created the entangled trios method, which is actually really exciting. So one of the ways, for example, we use that is for an articulated need mapping. If you want to get people to understand Agile, find a way to map existing capability against unarticulated needs of customers, and you'll be a hero. Yeah, the thing Apple were brilliant at was not mapping what customers wanted, but actually creating things which instantiated unarticulated needs. Yeah, we have a whole approach on that. So one of the ways we do that, for example, is put senior systems architect together with young naive programmer, together with user trained to talk to IT people. We are actually about to make that course available, by the way. It's a lot easier to train users to talk to IT people than train IT people to understand users. Yeah. There's all sorts of cognitive reasons for that. And then you throw 15 trios at the problem. You don't send out a systems analyst. Yeah, and you get much more diverse results from that. So, and again, it's starting to introduce those forms of organization. The other thing on this is generally successful teams should be broken up. We did a lot of work on this in IBM in outsourcing. And we ended up, the trouble with successful teams is they don't recognize the amount of luck involved in their success and they get complacent. So breaking them up and redistributing them makes sense. Teams that fail that learn, keep them together because they'll always succeed the second time. And teams that failed and didn't learn, fire them. Yeah. And we instituted that in IBM Europe, and IBM States could never understand it. They just couldn't get it. You're breaking up successful teams. Yeah, we're breaking them up because successful teams don't understand why they were successful. Yes, so we want to spread the knowledge, but yeah.
Does that answer your question, Baz?
Yeah, it raises a small extra question. By you said determining the lowest level of coherence in decomposing. what would that be within?
You've got Dunbar's numbers, all right. There's actually better science than Dunbar now. If you look at the blog I put up yesterday, you'll see the number ranges on that. On context, the lowest level of coherence can be actually 2 people, 5 people, 20 people. So the combinations are different based on the context of use, right? And a lot of this goes back. So for example, a binary relationship, which is parent-child, allows for very tight imitation. Whereas a group of 5 or 6 is actually a good hunter-gatherer group in terms of communication and so on. So one of the things I think is, and I think Spotify were moving towards this. The trouble is people have copied the output of an evolutionary process rather than going through the same journey, right? Is combining and recombining and building, for example, groups of 5 in which you have at least 30% overlap between groups of 5 so that you get those sort of flows. And this is what the method like entangled trios worked. It can also be entangled 5s, by the way. Yeah. And again, that was devised on that principle.
Right, thank you.
Thanks, Baz. Okay, for our last 2 questions of the evening, so, or the afternoon or morning, dependent on where you are. So, Matt, first over to you, mate.
I don't really have a question, but I was just sort of a thought based on what Dave was saying about, like, I mean, a lot of digital transformations and other sorts of transformations in our own organizations or in the public sector or whatever, like a lot of them fail. So trying to do something slightly different probably isn't a bad way to go when the failure rate is so high. Yeah, I mean, otherwise I just thought it was a really interesting talk.
There's a key principle there, which is worth thinking. I say it's in a lot of people in NHS. You keep doing context-free interventions in a context-specific world. And what you need to do is to do micro-interventions, yeah? Or it's also known as hyper-localization, if you want, yeah? Hyper-localized interventions, not global interventions.
All right, Matt, thanks very much. So our last question of the morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Mike, over to you.
Hi, David. Thanks very much. That was a very intriguing conversation. It's interesting that I almost feel like when I listen to these conversations, when I hear people talk about Agile or Gemba or Kanban or Lean, it's as if you have a bunch of blindfolded people touching the elephant that is Toyota and only describing a bit of what makes them successful. That the origin of all these concepts were pretty much was Toyota, and of course they built from what they saw during that time. And it does seem that the energy gradient required to move from that system is so great that most of my experience is working with big automotive, big manufacturers. And the crazy thing is Toyota let us into their plants. They said, come on in, we'll show you anything you want, everywhere you want to go. And yet to make that transition has been so difficult. When you talked about the Gemba at Boeing, I could see how that would work with end-on cords and people would understand problems. But if the rest of the organization isn't willing to respond to that, to those inputs, then you get the 737 MAX. And there's a good case study about Dr. Semmelweis in the 1840s about germ theory and washing hands that I think we'll find interesting. I'm interested to know, how do you move people beyond that? How do you get people to expend the energy required so that we're able to respond to a pandemic, we're able to respond to the energy crisis that we're now living through, or the climate crisis that we're now living through? Because that does require a tremendous expenditure of energy.
Actually, it doesn't. And I think, so I've come off various calls on this today, right? Including stuff we're doing in South Africa on counter corruption, yeah? And stuff we're doing in the States at the moment on post-election peace and conflict. And it's based on a challenge Poindexter gave me years ago. He said, how do we overcome Ashby's law in counterterrorism? Yeah. And I mean, the restrictions are always fun if you're people like me, all right? Ashby's law says only variety can match variety. So that the problem with asymmetric threat, all right, is you as a symmetric power are having to increasingly expose energy to respond to lots and lots of stimulus that you can never understand. Yeah. And that's the Ashby restriction. Now, what we came up with there is the idea of using citizen sensor networks. So by changing the sensor network, you change the energy gradient radically. So the work, for example, we're doing in the States is by using young people in sports clubs, churches, and schools as citizen journalists and ethnographers to gather material from their local communities, and then identifying things which are in common between red and blue, and getting people from both political backgrounds to work on those problems together and let them have the conversation about the political difference later. Now that's based on work I originally did in Northern Ireland in the 70s, all right, where we had two approaches to peace and reconciliation. One was Corrymeela, which was world famous, yeah, and got everybody together in a big workshop, and they all agreed that it would be a good idea if Catholics didn't throw bombs at Protestants and vice versa. Something which was wonderfully satirized in Derry Girls. I've just given you the link to that, all right, where the Protestant boys come into a peace and reconciliation process with the Catholic girls. It's hysterically funny, right? I mean, it didn't work on a sustained basis. I was working with a Jesuit group then. We took people from both communities and dumped them into Latin America in small teams for 6 months. And we didn't talk about Catholic Protestant. Yeah, and they discovered they had a lot more in common than they thought, and they had the conversations when they were ready to do it. Now, that approach we've also adopted in organizational change. And it's going to micro level interventions. And we just put a big brochure out on climate change based on this. You've got to find, in order for a program of change to happen, it has to be empathetically proximate to individuals. It can't just be a grand goal. And in order to make that, you have to give people ownership of the interpretation of the problem. Yeah? And that's what we've been doing with employee sensor networks and citizen sensor networks, which are outlined in the EU field guide, is you change the sensor mechanism, and that changes the way information flows, and it changes the energy gradient. And the minute I say Ashby's law can be overcome, I get bounced on by cybernetics fanboys and systems dynamics people and other people for whom Ashby is a saint. But yeah, Ashby is very valuable. But if you change, I mean, this is looking at it from a physics point of view. You change the way you change the focus point of the way you get data. So you don't accept that as a restriction. And to give an illustration on this, I mean, it's a final story. I was trying to explain this at one of those intelligence conferences in the States, and I've done a few in my life, including one where bloody Clapper put me on as a keynote. And I had 2,000 bloody CIA people in a hall, and he announced Snowden was keynoting at his conference and didn't tell them which Snowden. And I said to him after, why the fuck did you do that to me? And he said, well, it made sure everybody turned up on time, all right? But I remember doing one in Maryland. It was one of those ones where it takes you about 3 hours to get in, all right? And, you know, through security. And then you present to the group, and then you get sent out of the room while they discuss what you've said because you're not cleared for it. Then you come back in and they ask you questions, which means you know what they were talking about. And I just explained this. And I said, look, if we want to really counter Al-Qaeda, right? What you've got to do is you use citizens as sensor networks, so you reduce the energy cost of you processing information as a government. Yeah, effectively, I mean, this is based on the Stasi concept of one informer for every 30 members of the East German population, right? So you do that. And I said, then you throw information at the terrorists, so they're forced up Ashby's curve. So you don't just passively respond, you throw information to the other guys and reveal it. And somebody said, well, give us an example of what we could do to Al-Qaeda. And I don't know whether you've ever been in this situation, but you think of a perfect example which is entirely inappropriate for your audience. And then you can't get it out of your mind. So I was stuck there. And so, oh, to hell with it, I'll go for it. And I said, well, the next time Sharon comes to Washington, he was Prime Minister of Israel at the time, you arrest him as a war criminal. And everything went absolutely silent, all right? And I got asked to explain myself. And I said, well, I thought I'd go to hell with her. I said, well, for a start, I actually think he is, all right? But even if you don't agree with me on that, what the hell do you think Al-Qaeda would do if you did that? It would just throw their entire myth structure. And in responding to that, they will reveal everything. And I eventually got a standing ovation on that one, but I had been thinking about Lee's retreat from Gettysburg and how could I get to Dulles Airport without being beaten up in the process. But it's taking where people are and doing a twist and showing them a different way of doing things, and then allowing a system to emerge. That's why I don't like the transformation word. You should always be seeking to evolve a system. A catastrophic change in a system is always dangerous. Yeah, because the one thing which is absolutely certain about any complex adaptive system is whatever you do will have unintended consequences. And you're ethically responsible for those.
Well, Dave, for that, I think we're all giving you a virtual standing ovation for obviously your talk here tonight. And I think everyone just needs to show their appreciation for Dave coming along and actually, yeah, sharing some amazing thought bombs throughout the evening. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you everyone for asking your questions as ever. Holger, Christina, Julia, Dean, Philippe, Baz, Matt and Mike, really, really appreciate you guys asking your questions to Dave today. Ash, I'm going to hand over to you to wrap us up and to obviously let everybody know what's coming up next.
Great, thank you. And thank you again, Dave. So what we have next in 2 weeks, exactly today, we've got Simon Wardley taking this home for us, the third part of the mini building series. We're going to get that posted ASAP. A couple weeks after that, 15th of Feb, we have Alkesh, who you all saw on the call tonight. He's going to come and give a talk on innovation and quarterly planning. And then a couple weeks after that, Dave and co with some special additional speakers that I'm not going to tell you now because you have to come back and be surprised, okay? They're going to be coming back on the 8th of March for a panel event. And next week, Dave, Co, and I are, and Giles, we're getting together to just think about what exactly do we want to talk about, building on all the feedback from this mini series. So it's going to be awesome. Thank you so much, Dave. This has been fantastic. Thank you, Giles. Amazing.
Thanks,
cool.
Ash. Thanks, Dave. Again, thank you everyone for coming. It's you guys who make it, and thanks very much for being here as ever. And look forward to seeing you in a few weeks' time. Have a great rest of your day wherever you are. Cheers, Dave. Thanks very much indeed.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.